Testing, one, two, three, testing.
Hello.
Hello and welcome to Pan with Paige, a podcast about the beautiful instrument from Trinidad and Tobago called the steel pan. For today's episode, I spoke to a couple of my friends to get their thoughts about pan in the United States. First, you'll hear from Kadesh Clouden, a terrific musician and human being who was born and raised in Trinidad and now lives in the United States as a graduate student at Missouri State University. I met Kadesh in the Brooklyn-based steel band called Pan in Motion when we both played in the New York Panorama this past summer, and I knew he'd be a great person to talk to about the subject. Next, I spoke with Josh Quillen, who's a prominent figure in the world of concert percussion and chamber music as a member of So Percussion, and who has extensive steel pan experience. I asked both of them to talk with me about their backgrounds in steel pan, some differences and similarities they've noticed between pan in Trinidad versus pan in the United States, and what they would like to see in the American pan scene moving forward. Hope you enjoy.
So to tell you a little bit more about what we're doing, I'm doing this podcast episode about steel pan, and basically the overarching topic that I'm looking at is comparing and contrasting what steel pan looks like in the United States versus in Trinidad. Obviously, I have some firsthand experience here, but I haven't gone to Trinidad yet. I'm supposed to go in a few months and hopefully get to experience that, but I can't make any claims about what it's like in Trinidad because I just haven't been there. I've read books and stuff, but don't have my own experience. First, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your background in pan, like when you started playing it, what context you started playing it, where you're at now, just a little bit about your pan and musical journey.
Yeah, sure. So I started playing when I was like around 8 or 9 years old. I think at the time I was trying to get into dance, and my mom quite didn't like that, but she also saw that I liked music. And there was this steel band in the neighborhood. So we made those connections. So I joined that steel band like around maybe 2008, 2009.
And where was that?
This is in Laventil in Trinidad and Tobago. And I played with Laventil Sarnitas. So that was the first band that I played with because I lived in that Port of Spain area. I think it started off as like a summer camp thing. And then that same group of persons morphed into what became the new phase of the band. It always felt like that second community. You would go to school, you get back home, and I was like, all right, I need to go to the Panyard. And you go and you learn your music. And that communal space, maybe like an extracurricular. But as I got older, I got really good at it. 1 to 2 years in, I became a section leader within the bass section. And then I kept progressing, and then it reached a point where I would learn music for all the different pans. So I would just hop around during the breaks, and it's like, oh, so what do you play here? And so I always found it interesting to find out what the other instruments were playing. And so with doing that, I think my skills progressed a lot more. And soon enough, it became not enough for me anymore. So I branched out. It's like, you know what? Desperados is within the same area. It's close to home. So I ended up playing with Desperados for, I think, a couple of years while still balancing with Laventil Sarnitas. And then in 2013, I stopped playing with Desperados. And I think I had moved to Belmont, which was a lot closer to Invaders. I was like, you know what? Yes, let me go play with Invaders. So from 2014 up until when I left for the US in 2022, I would have played with Invaders Steel Orchestra, where I would have taken on various leadership roles in the youth band and section leader positions during Panorama. So it's been a very evolving experience for me from then till now, just being a part of that community space. And I made it into a career in terms of playing and teaching. And so it led me to where I am today as a conductor here in the US.
Awesome. You're in school now. Do you get to do much steel pan stuff in your university, or is there a steel band there, or is that pretty secondary to your studies right now?
Yeah, when I first reached out to Missouri State, one of the defining factors was that they had a steel band, because I think to make myself more of a necessity, I brought a skill that I thought would be beneficial, not just to myself coming into the space, but also to these students there getting to branch out into the wider role of steel pans because I saw a lot in my transition of getting older, how fascinated people were of the instrument and how interested they were of learning it. And Vedas did a lot of those tours, or they would have visitors to the Panyad a lot, where they would do lots of demonstrations. And so it already got me into thinking, oh, how do I engage and interact with people to get them to learn the instrument? When I chose Missouri State, I knew they had a steel band and I leveraged that in terms of scholarship things. And so the school was really interested in having me there for conducting, but also glad that I would be able to contribute to their steel band and their percussion studio.
Yeah. How big is the band there right now, ish?
Right now, there's one of each pan. So there's technically we have two leads, a double tenor, a double second, and then a cello and a bass. So it's not a very large band. I think right now it's not operating this semester because I don't think many students were enrolled in it this semester. But when I first got here in spring of 23, we had a very large group to the point where I think we might have had to double on some instruments. And then in fall of that year, I think we also had a very decent sized group. But as my degree progressed and I started focusing a lot more on conducting, I had to go up some of the ensemble things in steel pan. But I always joined them at the end of the semester performance where I could still side read the music and just join them.
Is it mostly percussion majors that play in that, or music majors, or is it anyone can join?
So when I first got there, it was mainly percussion majors and like one or two others who were also affiliated with the percussion studio. I think in last spring, they had a lot more persons who weren't music majors and who actually didn't read music because I was really pushing to see how we can integrate the wider campus community. It's not the same as in Trinidad where people grasp and they move really fast. So even though we integrated these non-music majors, we had to make accommodations to get them to that playing level because you're learning the instrument and they also need to read music, which you've never done before. That was a challenge that I kind of had to navigate, but yet still wanting persons to be engaged with the instruments.
Yeah, definitely. So can you talk, based on your experience, a little bit about similarities and differences that you've noticed when playing with groups in the United States versus playing with groups in Trinidad, either specific musical things or just like approach, anything that stands out to you?
The most glaring thing would be the fact that we're reading music. Growing up in different steel pan communities back home, there's never really the use of a music score unless you're in a university band or you have to learn a classical piece, which then one person would read the score and just designate what notes everybody's playing. And I even tried teaching some things by rote, and it was successful. But there's not that culture of rote learning generally within the US. A lot of the bands that we see are like high school bands or college ensembles or bands where we're using a lot of notated music. So that's like the most glaring difference, I would say. Another difference I would say is in the approach of rehearsal style. I choose my words wisely here. I think after being in the US and just seeing how music is taught at this level and in different spaces, I do think in Trinidad, we don't utilize rehearsal time as efficiently as we possibly can. In the US, we're using music scores, so you just show up and run through things. But I feel like in Trinidad, we spend so many hours in the Panyards practicing. We spend so much time practicing things that could have been done more efficiently type of thing. When I was like in the middle of my undergrad degree at UTT, Trinidad and Tobago, I started getting really frustrated with invaders at the time because I'm learning how we can be efficient with music and learning. And then you go to the Panyard and we spend hours and you're exhausted. And I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. There is that contrast of being a lot more efficient. Of course, schools here can't be inefficient because they're working on a crunch or they have many other ensembles to go to. But I think it's that communal aspect, which we can also connect back to being learning by rote and not having notation. So it's just that slight frustration I have now, knowing how it takes to be a lot more efficient and referencing the culture that is there with rote learning that kind of frustrates me.
Yeah, I get what you're saying with the efficiency thing, but also maybe because then you end up spending so much time together in the Panyards, there's like a different sense of community and stuff versus rehearsals that are more efficient and structured where it's like, show up, we're going to get done what we need to get done, and then rehearsal's over and everyone goes to their next thing. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, about just like the Panyard community culture and what that means?
Definitely. I think a major thing that I realized when moving to the US was that everything is very individualized. Everybody's on their own path. And whilst I wish rehearsals would be a lot more efficient, it does add to that whole community aspect of it. Because whilst they're working on a particular section, you get to interact a lot more with the persons that are close to you, and you engage and you do a lot more. And I think that's a very treasured part of learning by roads or within a communal space in a Panyard. It really allows you to connect more with the people around you and really build that sense of community. Yeah, you can do that during breaks in some rehearsals here, but I don't think it's the same because, again, culturally, I don't think most persons within the US really think about that big communal aspect. And unless you're exposed to a director that encourages it, you're more or less within your own bubble. Oh, I learned my part, so I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that huge communal aspect that I think is a major treasure of Panyards and learning by rote that I think some American students lose out on because they don't know otherwise. It's not something that they're actually taught to engage with.
Yeah, if you show up to a rehearsal, whether it's steel band or chamber music or whatever, and even if you're like, oh, I forget how this part goes or something, if you have the music in front of you, you're just going to look at that music and try to figure it out, versus if it's taught by rote, if you missed some notes the previous day or something, you get there and you have to ask someone else, can you show me? Can you teach me? And then in a different way, it's like we are actively helping each other along. If you missed rehearsal the night before, okay, what didn't you get? I'll teach it to you. And there's something, yes, maybe inefficient about that, but yeah, there's also such a nice community aspect that we often miss out on in these kinds of contexts within the United States with our approach, where it is very like, even if I know my part and the person next to me doesn't, maybe I'm like, I'm good. They need to figure that out.
They need to practice.
Yeah, they need to just practice more. And it's less of a like, here, let me show you, let me teach you, and let's figure it out together. So yeah, I think there's something nice about that. Sometimes it can be hard in these contexts, especially in like an academic setting, I feel like, to have that bit of vulnerability and be like, hey, I'm not getting this. Can you practice with me? Can we run this section? That can actually be, I don't want to say taboo. I don't think it's that bad, but it can be like, oh, does that make me look bad? Versus it just being a part of the experience. And one day I'm going to say, I can't play this. Can you help me? And then the next day they're going to do the same to me. And it's a more back and forth thing. So yeah, I think that's a really meaningful part of it that we don't always get here. When you were at UTT for undergrad, were you in a band there in addition to Invaders?
Yeah, the whole UTT experience, one, they have the large steel orchestra that everyone's a part of. And then within UTT, I think we branched off into 4 smaller ensembles. There's 4 different groups that you branch off into, and you need a manager, you need a captain, you need an arranger, you need a treasurer. So it encourages the business side, and it also encourages the group deciding on what they're going to play, what they're going to wear. So it's very, looking back at it now, it's very essential to understanding how to work in a group, how to manage the group. And of course, there's going to be clashes in personality styles and stuff, learning how to navigate those dynamics. But it also allowed for us to be explorative in our arrangements, different compositions. It was that nice blend of learning music from notation and also incorporating by rote elements. In that bubble that was UTT, we had our large ensemble, large orchestra that would learn very intense classical pieces, but we also had our smaller groups that we would operate in that gave us that business side, but also musical freedom to do different things. So yes, I was very much engaged in that, which excluded all of my other steampunk things happening in the communities.
That's really interesting to hear how it was structured and that you each got your own little ecosystem to work with. Am I correct that at the universities there, like UTT, can you major in Pan? Did you get a Pan degree, or was it a different kind of music degree?
Yeah, so I did the Bachelor of Fine Arts in Performing Arts with a music specialization. And then I had
Mm.
like a capstone in ethnomusicology. But yes, the BFA program at UTT offers the specialization in steel pan. And so I did 4 years there within steel pan and, of course, branching out into other aspects of music. But it is an essential part there of the program that is in UTT. And then they also have that master's in carnival studies,
Mm.
is very rooted in the culture of Trinidad and Tobago as far as carnival is concerned, Panorama, and Calypso. So you go really in depth in those research aspects, and you're usually on the ground all the time, interacting in these different spaces.
Awesome. That's really cool. Having seen and played in a couple different contexts of pan in the United States, like Brooklyn Panorama or within the university, etc., in what context within the United States do you feel like it's been the most similar to in Trinidad? Like, was playing with pan in motion, is that kind of similar to in Trinidad, or is it still its own thing, very separate?
Oh no, it's very much like playing in Trinidad.
Hmm.
For one, we're learning an 8 minute tune all by rote. The experience there being practicing for maybe 2 months, this one tune that the arranger is developing and going through that process of, he's working on this section. Oh, you know what? I want to go back and change some things. So that whole process, that kind of motion goes through in their Panorama season is exactly what the experience is like in Trinidad. Because again, learning by rote, there's things that we might play tonight that the arranger might want to change or alter. In that way, it's very much similar to Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, that same communal aspect is very much what you would get in a Trinidad panyard. And each panyard has their own culture and how the way that they do things. But I would say yes, pan motion has been a very good replica of the experience that you get in Trinidad.
Do you feel like when you're playing in Trinidad versus playing here or even teaching, do you change your approach based on where you are, or do you just do the same thing regardless and have your way of doing it?
It's interesting because, yes, I played in Invada's senior band stateside for a number of years, but I also assisted with the Invada's youth steel orchestra. And because it's a youth band, you deal with mostly between the ages of 8 through 21. So I feel like the experiences that I've had working with such a diverse age range, I think it gave me the ability to adapt in my rehearsal style type of things. But also, I felt like it was so much easier to navigate rhythms because it's so rooted in our culture. I feel most of these steel bands that I've worked with in the US, more on the academic side, it's really like they focus on each notation. It's never really from the aspect of feeling the rhythm through. So it's,
Yep.
I think it's been a challenge for me to navigate. Come on, guys, feel it, feel it. What I was as opposed to, okay, look at the rhythm, guys. Here is beat one. So it's been interesting in that regard. I think what I've tried to do is try to provide that same overall experience of the rehearsal process in terms of, okay, understanding where your part plays into the whole arrangement or the whole piece. So that's more or less been what that process has been so far. But yes, presented challenges, of course, because they don't have that cultural side of doing it.
Yeah, that answer doesn't shock me. I had to give a presentation the other day. I at one point said, I was talking about this, like the sense of groove, and I said you could take the whole percussion studio here at the University of Michigan and they would fail miserably at playing like what the guitars were playing. They were just playing upbeats for like 10 minutes. Like it was so easy and it felt great. And I'm like, if you get a bunch of these concert percussionists doing that, they're going to go, well, and they're going to ruin it. They can't do it. They last maybe 10 seconds. And there's like a 15-year-old next to me going, go, 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 go. Like it's just so easy. And yeah, so that answer doesn't surprise me. We're not maybe known for our sense of groove, us American white folks.
That's okay. But I think it's important to allow yourself to relax into it.
Yeah, it's almost, at least in my experience playing with Pan Emotion, it was like I had to trust myself a little bit more
Hmm.
instead of trying to be so calculated with it so that I didn't mess up or something. People around me were saying, relax, you just have to feel it. Or if
Yeah,
I was like, how many times do we repeat this thing? They're like, I don't know,
yeah,
just feel
feel
it.
it. Yeah,
Just trust your musical intuition and just trust that you'll hear when to change notes or, which was a nice reminder because I feel like so much of what I do in the day to day is very calculated and that very micro
mm,
looking at every note and what's your timbre on this little, it's all just very minuscule and stuff. And I think I was just too in the weeds with how I was thinking about it. And I needed
yeah,
the reminders of just relax, just
feel it.
groove and just
Yeah.
feel it. And then it'll sound better anyway. One thing I wanted to talk about too was in the United States, at least, and based on my research, it doesn't seem like this is as much the case in Trinidad. Of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the United States, there's a lot of contemporary uses of pan, whether that's using extended techniques or putting it in different ensembles, putting it
Mhm.
in a funk band or playing it with a cello or maybe using electronics with pan or things like that. So first, is that the case in Trinidad or is it used more quote unquote traditionally in Trinidad? And what's your perception on these contemporary uses? Because I struggle with knowing like where the line is or whether, because it's not my instrument and I think it sounds great and we know that it's a very versatile instrument. It can play a lot of genres, but should I be someone that plays it in these more contemporary ways or maybe not?
Yeah, I think in Trinidad, unless you're in that academic environment, it's usually played in the traditional sense. Because I think to the history that's within steel band is projecting the versatility of it, being able to play Latin and jazz and Caribbean fusion and calypso. It's always been from the entertainment realm where they would play music to appease their audience or to get their audience enjoying that
Mm-hmm.
experience. And so it's always been in a very performative way of playing calypso and playing soca because you want to create this excitement. And even if you go into spaces that are doing a lot more jazz oriented things, so it's, I know specifically the Moyen group, which features Natasha, Joseph, and Chantal Estelle, they do a lot more ethnically grounded jazz things, but it's more so in appeasing their jazz circle there. So it's always been in that very performative way of showing versatility of the instrument, but yet still thinking of how persons would enjoy it on the outside. I too only really got into the more explorative side of it during my undergrad because we
Mm.
were hearing of pieces from Andy Akiho and persons who would be doing innovative things with it. And so, wow, that's so cool. I didn't know I could do that. So it's in that period of exploration where we see, oh, maybe I can try this, or maybe I can see what the instrument can do here. And once it's not causing any extreme damage to the instrument, it's perfectly fine. And so I think within the context of persons within the US, they don't have that culture of playing music just to appease their audience. And so what I've realized is that in their own way, they're trying to find that placement for it by incorporating it in ways that they know how, like composition students wanting
Mm.
to try different things with it because they're learning about it, or percussionists seeing it more as like the engine room driving thing that they know it to be. So I think everyone is grasping their understanding of the instrument and how it could be utilized. You're not wrong in wanting to explore the contemporary side of it. It's just that you would only find that contemporary exploration of it through university settings in Trinidad and Tobago right now
Mm-hmm.
because they are so proud of what it could do culturally within its current context that they don't see the need to really explore. So it has its place in serving the traditions and culture of the country at that of this time. But of course, and I think when I've done presentations at MSU here, yes, we played calypsos and we played soca, but I've always encouraged the other music majors, hey, do you want to incorporate it in the composition? Do you want to do this? It pairs well with brass, pairs well with winds. So I think it's their way of getting to understand how it works for them or within the things that they are aware of, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, my last question is if you had a magic wand and
Mhm.
could make Pan in the United States look the way you wanted, Are there specific things that you would change or that you would wish for the trajectory of Pan, especially given that, at least currently within the United States, the vast majority of the time, if you're getting exposed to Pan, it's in a university setting and it's within an academic context. And that also means that it's pretty privileged people that are even able to get a university degree. But so that already changes a lot about our exposure to it, especially given that's the reality. Is there anything that you wish would become the standard, or wish that would change, or wish a certain trajectory moving forward, anything like that?
When yourself, me and Josh spoke at Animation this year, we spoke about educators not knowing how to integrate it and being not wanting to cause any havoc or being afraid to utilize it. I think that's the only thing I would change if I had a magic wand, to allow persons to be a lot more open to exploring the instrument. I think within the context of the US and maybe other countries, as Pan continues to grow, all we can do right now is continue to show, one, what the instrument can do, its cultural background, and knowing the impact that it has at Trinidad and Tobago, because pans are also seen as this way of building community. And it's seen as that symbol of breaking down violence or connecting youth. So if I had a magic wand that I could wave and change things for the instrument, would be that persons are a lot more open to exploring it and a lot more willing to integrate it into their current experience. I don't think that steel pan should be one thing. I think it'd be unfair to the pioneers of the instrument who were seeing it serving their community. And so I think of it as serving the community of which it's in. So it wouldn't look the same as in Trinidad. It wouldn't look the same as in Canada. Of course, we would carry different cultural things from Trinidad to these different spaces. But I also think it's important for Pan to blossom within whatever community it resides in. I think it's important as educators that we allow the instrument to blossom within our communities, but yet still, of course, acknowledging and respecting where it came from and its cultural symbol within the communities that it's in.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I like what you said about how you think about it serving the community that it's in, and how that can inherently change it based on the context, and how maybe that's fine as long as, yes, it does still acknowledge and honor where it came from. Of course, we don't want to ignore that. But yeah, maybe it's not inherently a bad thing that Pan is different in the United States. Maybe it's good both ways, and just it serves a different purpose here. And that's also, like you said, why we're getting a lot of these contemporary uses and people seeing what the limit is. Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I can only say that because I had the privilege of traveling to Japan, and I had the privilege of traveling to the various parts of the US and throughout the Caribbean. And when I went to Japan, it was very interesting because, yes, they play soca or calypso, but they also play really fun Japanese tunes. And it's, oh, wow, this is awesome. And so I think if we start restricting the instrument to only play calypso and soca, I don't think we would have the growth that we would admire or want for it if we only restrict it to one cultural thing. And the instrument is still very young. So for it to have the reach and expansiveness, it needs to be able to grow within these different global communities, while still, yes, acknowledging its origins, but allowing it to blossom in the cultures that it's in.
Yeah, it is, I think, in a lot of ways, a uniquely versatile instrument, almost like piano or something that can really be put into so many different contexts and sound great and function well, be written for, work with other instruments. And so it is fun to explore different uses of it. And I think for me, I feel like that can be a way of honoring the instrument, is putting it in like this contemporary context, and it will show more people what the instrument is, because there are still so many people that have just never seen or heard of steel pan. But there has always been part of me that's like, even if it's my way of showing admiration for the instrument, I still don't know if that's taking it out of that more traditional use, because it's like, even if somebody sees me play and goes, oh, how cool, a new instrument that I've never heard of. They're seeing me, a white person, playing with a cello in a fancy concert hall or something. Like it is a very different context. So I always feel a little bit conflicted about what the line is. But yeah, and there's no cut and dry answer. Everyone has different perspectives. And I'm sure that there are some people that I could talk to that would say, no, we should only be playing calypso and soca, and panorama music is it, and stop putting it in these funk bands and these other things. So everyone has their own vibe with it. But yeah, I always appreciate hearing perspectives on that from more and more people, just to get more thoughts about it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think with everything you do, there's always going to be people who feel like, oh, it should only be this way and it should only be that. I definitely think as educators, it's important to show what the new pathways that things can go. Yes, this is where it's been. This is where we can possibly see it going. And I think for us to continue to grow, we need to. Mm-hmm. If we don't evolve with technology or evolve with the times, then it becomes a dying tradition or a dying art form. And I think for it to continue to grow with time, it needs to be able to be relevant. This might sound harsh, but anyone who says that it doesn't need these extended styles, they're wrong. Because let's be honest, if it only played 1960s calypso, it would not stand up in Trinidad, because not everyone or their granny is in tune to those 1950s or 1940s calypsos. And I think if it only stayed within that realm or that time of musical expression, I don't think the wider reach of Trinidad would have been with the instrument today. And it's because of its ever-growing qualities is why it's growing now or continuing to be relevant. I think with any art form, with any tradition, if you can bring those traditions into the modern sense while still respecting where it comes from, it has a better chance of standing the test of time.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not often that we get to see a really young iteration of an instrument. There's people that are still alive that were around when it was first created. So there's something really magical about that. And it almost creates a sense of responsibility or something. Like, how can current pan players help it stand the test of time? Or I was talking to Josh, he's concerned about, with so much being taught by rote and not being written down, years from now, that music might be lost. And so he's always trying to get his friends to write stuff down.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that too has been a problem that we've been trying to address slowly. There are companies that are willing to do everything for you. But then there's also, you're going to steal music. You're going to do, because there's been that culture within the steel pan world in Trinidad of foreign transcribers coming and transcribing the music and then going off and telling it as their own. So I think culturally, and it's not just in music actually, I think it's throughout all the different artistic expressions in the country, Trinidad and Tobago. And I think the same could be said for most countries, that you really rely on oral traditions. I think there's that fear of it being misused or taken. But I'm also upset because if you don't write it down, then how do you expect us to remember it?
Yeah. Cool. I really appreciate you having the time to talk with me. And this was a really interesting conversation. I could talk about this all day. Thank you so much.
Hey, I think it's a really interesting topic to look at. And all the best on your project. Take care.
So I thought it would be cool to do a podcast episode interviewing a couple people to talk more about steel pan. And specifically, I'm looking at some of the similarities and differences between what steel pan looks like in the United States versus Trinidad. So first, can you just talk a little bit about your background in pan, how you got started, just a little bit about your pan background?
Yeah, I think I had a pretty unorthodox introduction to the steel pan in general. I first saw it when I was in 5th grade. This is like 1988 or 1990. The woman who was running the middle school bands, and then she did the high school percussion section, like marching band and concert band stuff. Her name was Joan Wenzel, and she went to the University of Akron. for her undergrad. She was there either right when or shortly after Dr. Larry Snyder at the University of Akron started a steel band program at the collegiate level. And at the time, the University of Akron, West Virginia University, where Ellie Manette was at, and then Cliff Alexis out at Northern Illinois. There were others, just to be clear. But in terms of the collegiate level, at that time, there was like 3 steel bands functioning at a collegiate level. And so my teacher, Joan, went to Akron, and so she had an experience with this. And when she left there, she stayed in touch with Cliff Alexis and purchased the very first set of instruments he built when he moved from Trinidad to the United States. And then she got the job at Dover High School, which is where I was at. And sorry, long story short, as part of like my instrument petting zoo in 5th grade, that they sort of cycle you through the gymnasium, you play the flute, you squawk on a tuba, and then you get to pick your instrument. The steel band played at that, and I was just like, what in the hell am I seeing? Except I also thought that was normal for everybody. We didn't have YouTube, we didn't have the internet, so I just was like, cool, this is what everybody is doing. Except you weren't allowed to play it until you got to high school. So I studied with Joan in 5th grade. She started me on snare drum and learning how to just read music and basic things like that. And then when I got to high school, every Tuesday and Thursday, the steel band met. And that is, again, like it wasn't like a unique thing. It was a normal thing. And it was a status quo in Dover, Ohio in the late 80s and early 90s. Every event that happened in town, there was a steel band playing. Joan had Cliff Alexis in as a guest artist one year to tune the drums and also just to hang out and coach the band. And that was my first experience, meeting anybody of color, first of all. Again, not to say that there weren't people of color in Dover when I was growing up, but in general, mostly white, mostly middle class, lower middle class, rural community. But Cliff was the first person from another world that I ever interacted with. Like, he just seemed like a wizard. And he came in and gave me a little bit of like where he was from and what his background was, but mainly just showed me some scars on his head that he had gotten when he was beat by police when he was a kid playing in a steel band. Because in Trinidad, it wasn't illegal, but it was frowned upon. Most steel bands in the 60s, 50s, 60s, post-World War II were seen as gangs. Cliff, that was like the first thing he said to me or showed me was like, listen, like it was his way of talking to 17-year-old Josh and being like, listen, bro, there's no way you're going to understand any of this until way down the line. But here's these scars. I then was like, I want to do what Joan Wenzel does for a living. This is crazy that she gets to just talk about drums all day and play steel pan. And so I want to do what you do. And she's like, okay, you need to do all the things to get into school. I ended up going to Ohio State because my family was a Ohio State Buckeye family. And they did have a steel band there. But again, I went into it thinking it must just be like my high school steel band because that's what we all do. And I went there and I did Script Ohio. I did the marching band. I did the whole thing. And it was really fun. Wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. But it was also my first time realizing that maybe the steel band wasn't a normal thing. Yes, there was a steel band, but it wasn't talked about in the same way as it was in my high school. There wasn't a kind of like weight put on it that I had been experiencing. And so I was like, why? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so after my second year, for many reasons, I ended up transferring up to the University of Akron because I knew that's where she went, and I knew there was a really thriving steel band program there, and it was an itch I wasn't getting scratched at Ohio State. When I got there, I was like, okay, this is more like the culture of the steel band vibe that I'm used to, and I was studying steel pan as a class. Like, I just couldn't believe it. This then was the second time I started getting introduced to folks from Trinidad. Earl Rodney was a guest artist one year, Liam Teague, Bugsy Sharp, Ray Holman, Andy Norell, not from Trinidad, but he is part of the scene, historically speaking. And so I started seeing all these people on a regular basis. And Bugsy Sharp was a guest one year, and he's a major arranger in Trinidad. One of the first best virtuosic steel drum players, I think, to really make a mark. Again, there's many others, but Bugsy's kind of legendary. And he was like, man, you should come to Trinidad and play in phase 2. And I was like, what? I knew that the steel band started there, but I didn't know much about it. I just knew it was the mecca of pan. And so I was like, sure, whatever. Again, no internet, no YouTube. I couldn't like Google restaurants to eat at. I just got a flight ticket in the mail and I got on a plane and went to Trinidad and then played in phase 2 for 3.5 weeks, working really in depth with that band. And just being a member of the band.
Were you playing for Panorama or were you just playing for? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I went down there for Panorama in particular during Carnival. It's a big Super Bowl of pan. The next day, there's a lot of soca competitions, and then they have Juve Morning, which starts on sundown of Sunday night and goes all the way basically through to Fat Tuesday. It's basically a 24-hour-long party. You're up all night, marching through the streets, drinking way too much random alcohol that is given to you, different types of food, you're dancing, there's bands playing. And so I was really fortunate to get to do all that too. And again, just as far as like cultural cold splashes of water, just be like, we didn't do Juve morning, we didn't do Carnival in my steel band in the US. That was a thing that I think just for many reasons was just kind of detached. We don't have Carnival in the United States. We do in New Orleans. There's a version of it that happens there, but it's not related to the steel band in New Orleans. So there was a detachment there that I was like, oh, okay. Like starting to realize there's a deeper history to this instrument and specifically how that history relates to Trinidad and how Carnival is woven into all of this mess. And what is Carnival and why is it Carnival? And what is it? What is the Lenten season? Why is religion mixed in all this? Like, what is a ruling class? Like all of these questions I started asking myself in college.
Mm-hmm.
What is colonialism? What is oppression? What is racism? Going to Trinidad also as a 20-year-old was the first time I realized what being an other was. Let me just put it that way. Like being one of two white guys in a 140-piece steel band.
Mm-hmm.
My brain, all of a sudden, there were like red flags going off as I walked in the room and be like, wait a minute, why the communication currency here is different and I don't know how to interact with this. And just like getting to have conversations with guys who were in the Black Panther movement during the civil rights era in Trinidad, like all of this stuff was like, I'm starting to untie the Gordian knot of humanity in front of me because of my involvement with the steel band, because Joan Wenzel marched me through that gymnasium in 5th grade.
Yeah.
That's a very long-winded answer to your question. But when I left Trinidad and came home, I had a renewed appreciation of what it was I was doing starting in 5th grade, what I had been doing and why I had been doing it. Why did Cliff show me those scars on his head? Like, why was that the first thing he did? He didn't talk to me about what the sea was or how the instruments were built. It was a human thing.
Yeah.
So getting to participate in Carnival at a young age, going back now like 6 or 7 times to Trinidad for having various roles there within the steel band, drilling, just performing, just has been really crucial to who I am and how I am as a person, but also just a wider understanding of the different status quos that I think people all over the world have, and trying really hard not to assign a value judgment to any of those based on what my personal status quo is. Like, oh, they don't read music, so they must be less smart than these other people who can read symphony. It's like, right. Well, as soon as an 8-year-old kid is playing circles around you and they've listened to the song like once or twice and they've got it, all bets are off. So anyway, that's one question down.
No, that's all great.
But those are my thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. And you even touched on some questions that I have coming up too. Could you talk more about what steel pan looked like, for example, at Akron or in these contexts where you were first like really part of a steel band? And it sounds like already you had a different version than when you went to Ohio, or so already maybe Akron was doing things, I don't want to necessarily say better, but we're having a different, maybe a more informed approach. So could you talk more about what specifically that looked like?
Yeah. So when I was in high school, the band was growing every year. And so I think now if you went to the Dover Steel Band concert, there's 30 or 40 players on stage. Like it's a pretty sizable ensemble, especially for a high school.
Definitely.
When I was in it was probably closer to 15 to 20 players.
Mm-hmm.
They were not all percussionists. Joan also was it was important to her that it wasn't just a drummer thing, because in Trinidad, it's not necessary that you are a percussionist, you are a steel panist. Mm-hmm. Like that is a unique thing unto itself. So it wasn't like an audition thing, but Joan looked for people who were willing to like tinker in a sandbox and explore something a step further. When Joan taught everything with sheet music, I think maybe did 1 or 2 things by rote, but not a whole lot. It was all with sheet music, which I would say is a big distinction between the U.S. and Trinidad. Just as a starting point, your experience going down to Trinidad, should you be able to go, would be one like there's not going to be sheet music in the pan yard. Somebody might have it, but most times the music is being disseminated orally. The other thing that Joan, I think, did a really good job with was she took advantage of her contacts from Trinidad and from the culture, and was always making sure to bring them into her scene. Cliff, Ray Holman came a bunch. So she was always bringing folks in. And again, as a teacher, now that I'm 45, I'm like, man, one of the best things you can do as a teacher is bring in people who are better than you. Joan is my hero, but she was always very good at being like, there's only so much I can do. I need to bring in Cliff, or I need to bring in Ray Holman or Tom. Joan's an amazing percussionist, but maybe soca drumming isn't where her wheelhouse is, so she can bring Tom in, or blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
She was always really good at that. And in hindsight, I think I wasn't tracking how important that particular way of teaching was. At Ohio State, there was the folks who were running the overall program there were thoughtful enough to have a steel band and realized that it was something maybe that could contribute to somebody's education while you're a student at Ohio State. But at least when I was there wasn't like a direct pipeline to somebody in the scene, and there weren't guest artists coming through. It was more of a auxiliary thing to the larger percussion department. So you played in steel band maybe once or twice a month, and we maybe did one gig a year. We played a piece or two on the percussion ensemble concert.
And it was all percussion majors then?
Yeah, and that was all percussion majors. So there were no non-majors in the ensemble. Again, it's just, there's no value judgment there. I think I would rather have that than no steel band at all.
Sure.
But I was spoiled. So like when I got there, I was just like, wait a minute, you don't talk about this all day, every day? That's BS. Again, I'd rather have one there than not at all. But so when I transferred, I went to the University of Akron. There, it was like the version of that at that time I was like, okay, this is what I need. I was in this thing that was really highly structured. Everything was sheet music. Every once in a while there'd be some rote stuff, but I was also then asked to play gigs. I was playing all these things. And so like as a vehicle to learn how to be a professional musician, the steel band at Akron, I think, was set up in a way that really watered that tree for me. At Akron, though, that Larry had a pretty direct pipeline to folks like Cliff, and Cliff also heavily invested in the University of Akron because all of the drums were built by Cliff there. And I think pedagogically, Cliff really saw in Larry somebody who took it as serious as maybe like, Nexus takes percussion ensemble music. And so Cliff was there every year tuning and talking and playing iron in the band. And then Cliff would be like, you should bring Bootsy in. Earl Rodney's this amazing soloist. You should bring him in. You should have Mia Gormady Benjamin in. You should have blah, blah, blah. And so there was a constant flow of folks from the culture from Trinidad and Tobago, and not just from Trinidad. I think one year there was a guest from St. Vincent. So just in terms of tapping into the larger Caribbean diaspora influences, but and young musicians, older musicians, folks who historically were around when the instrument was started. That was something Larry was like, really, listen, motherfuckers, we are born in a time period where we're really fortunate here. If you were around when Beethoven was editing his symphonies, and you weren't looking over his shoulder constantly, bro, why'd you cross that out? You're an idiot. Like, and so that's Larry's approach was very much that style. He also, because of that, he didn't push it on us, but he was always like, if you want to go to Trinidad, all you have to do is get on a plane. And so that was, in terms of my access to Trinidad, it was really through the University of Akron where the door was officially swung open to me to make that next step.
Awesome. So expanding on that, in your experience playing pan within these contexts in the United States, whether it's in a school system or even your gigging life, chamber music, etc., what would you say you have noticed are some key differences and similarities between what steel pan looks like in the United States versus in Trinidad? Do you change your approach in one context versus the next, and in what ways? What are the big takeaways that you've noticed experiencing pan in both areas?
One of the things I feel that I've had a hard time, well, I don't want to say a hard time, but that's been an interesting challenge. The biggest thing I noticed over time was feel. Just the way, feel and sound. Like, I think American bands can very quickly get to a really bad sound. When I say bad, I mean like really like the pans start to bark and distort.
Yeah.
I've realized that I think that is a misinterpretation of, or they're hearing a sound from a Caribbean band. Like you hear a big Panorama band play and it's really big, like it's aggressive and like in your face, but there's a way that they can control it to a point. I'm not explaining this very well. You know, when you're doing your double stroke roll, you're sticking everything out. And then there's that point where you have to switch to the bounces.
Yeah.
You get really good at that when you do it over the course of your life, and you can finesse and you can move between that gray area. And I think with sound, steel band sound, the Trinis and Caribbean folks can move in that gray area really easily. American bands have a hard time going from the single stroke to the bounce double. And it jumps to the like really loud and aggressive sound really quick. I think drums, like engine room stuff too, has been a real big thing that I started to focus on later in my teaching. Then I think if I were to do it over again, I would just harp on drumming from day one. A lot of the way a band plays comes from the drummer and comes from the engine room first. And if that drummer, if they know who in the section to play with at any given time, knowing that is something that helps get to the feel quicker than me harping on some stylistic or phrasing in the way the pans are playing. Like often in dealing with the engine room will solve some of those issues. And it's why I think when I play in a Panorama now, I actually am really keen to play in the engine room because I can sit back there and diagnose, I hear Jerry on changing his feel here. Why? I don't know. It'll take me a week to be like, oh, that's why. Okay, all right, I get it. Or I can hear him searching for a feel and changing where the snare sits depending on certain things. And then when he finds it, I'm like, okay, I hear him locking it in. I know I can hear what he found.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know how to get there. And that's something I think American bands, again, just because you're not around it, you're not listening to soca music all day. And then I think this is going to be the final answer to your question is rehearsal tempos. Often steel bands in Trinidad will rehearse very slowly for a very long period of time. And in Trinidad was the first time I heard a band play something slow, but it felt like that's the tempo it was supposed to be. And in America, at least in Western classic, I don't even just say America, because I think this is a thing that in Western classical music, when you're reading stuff, like you start slow, 1 E and a 2 and a 3 E, a 4, ding, whatever, and then you speed it up, whatever. But what if you just played, I don't know, De La Cruz 1 or De La Cruz 9, whatever the famous one is that everybody freaks out about? Like, all right, fine, your performance is on December 1st. What if you weren't able to bump the tempo up until Thanksgiving, but you had to start in July, and you just had to lower zap, boom, just low ride the shit out of that thing. Steel bands in Trinidad, I feel, are really good. Like, they don't play differently depending on the tempo. I tend to, when it's slow, I get lazy and I relax. Play the slow tempo like you play the fast tempo. That, I think, then feeds into the way a band sounds, the way a band feels. Like, all of those things, I think, are really built into the way Trinis rehearse music. And I would say, in particular, a lot of that too comes from the oral tradition. Like, the fact that music is disseminated note by note means that you can't just get up there on day one and be like, all right, everybody, top of the page, let's go, and a 1 and a 2 and a ready, see it, B, and go. It doesn't work that way. And so the process is a little slower. And I think that's something I notice. Even when I leave Trinidad, I feel like I forget. Those are some major differences I've noticed.
Yeah, cool. Given that you have this pretty extensive background within the United States and you have been to Trinidad a handful of times, when you're teaching a group in the United States now, especially the vast majority of the time, those of us that get exposed to pan, it usually happens through a university program. Like the percussion majors, you have percussion ensemble, and then maybe there's also a steel band, like what you were talking about. That was my experience too. So given that we're often in those types of settings, can you talk about like your approach when you're leading a steel band? Are you printing out sheet music? Are you teaching by rote? What are some ways that you're incorporating what you've learned from Trinidad? What are some ways that maybe you stick with the more quote unquote American approach? What's your kind of approach these days?
I'm trying to be a yes and approach to teaching in general, not even just with steel bands. I think I didn't do any rote teaching like for the first 8 years of my time at NYU. And then when I met Kendall and he came in and I started seeing how he worked in that realm, I realized the main reason I didn't do it is because I was afraid to. I just didn't know how to. I wasn't good at it. My ears, in terms of picking up stuff by ear, I wasn't so quick at that. And so I was just afraid. I was afraid to look bad. Putting music in front of my students was the safest thing for me as a player. Initially, at Princeton, the steel band that Kendall and I teach there, we teach it exclusively by rote now.
Okay.
Couple reasons. One, a lot of the students they're musicians, but they're not music majors. They're like physics majors who played violin in high school and whatever. And so they're taking this class. Sometimes the music reading isn't super high. And so putting a chart in front of them might actually slow the process down. And it's been really fun. It's been a nice challenge for me. I would say as a professional moving forward, just to answer your question, honestly, I would say a little bit of everything. When I'm in Trinidad, I have my iPad out and I'm looking at the score and I'm drilling things and rehearsing things, but it's not by ear. I'm not walking in there blind and just trying to pick it up by ear. Because my ears aren't that quick. They're getting better, but I'm not that quick. I'm often coming in at the last minute, so I haven't been there when the tune has been being taught, so I don't know the chart. And so when I have the chart in front of me, I can lean heavily on that skill set to provide what's needed in that moment. But I don't shy away from it either in Trinidad. I don't hide the fact that I'm reading music, and people will come up to me like, what is that? I'm like, oh, this is the chart that we're playing. Oh, how did they do that? And then if somebody wants to have a conversation about it, and happy to show them. Like, there are discussions around like cultural appropriation and whether or not you should be a purist about everything should be taught by rote because that's the way we started. It's like, yes. And what if you were as open to rote teaching as you were about reading music? Because I have students now who are like, I want to do what you do. I play in the studio sometimes. Like, I got sent a lead sheet by Caroline Shaw to lay down some steel drum stuff on this track. She doesn't have time to teach me by rote. She needed the track by yesterday and she sent it to me 2 days ago. So like, she sent me a lead sheet. with the chord changes. And so I went in there and I did 3 passes and sent her the stuff and moved on with my life. The reason I can do that and have a job and try to make my rent doing that is because my reading ability is at a high level. And so I think, like, when I talk to folks, if there's a Caribbean student who wanted to come to NYU or Princeton and they can't read music, I'd be like, listen, you have a lot to offer here. One thing I can offer you is I can help build this skill set for you so that if you do get called for a session or you do get called to play on Broadway or something like that, this isn't going to be a barrier for you. If you don't have any desire to read music, I'm certainly not going to force that on you either. But if wringing as much out of this experience as you possibly can is of interest to you, then let's sit down. I'll show you where middle C is, and all cows eat grass. We can do that. But again, I'm very opposed to like all one or all the other. I would say the biggest in terms of, if you like code switching, if there's a way I act different in Trinidad versus here, I would say that when I'm in Trinidad, I'm a representative of America, of white culture, of Western classical approach to this, but I'm a guest in that scene. And so I really try really hard to, I don't want to say assimilate, but go with the flow that is naturally occurring there and not try to divert things to make myself comfortable. But I also try really hard to speak up when I hear something that I think can be better and get past the idea that, well, I'm a white guy, I can't say anything to my friends who I know and love dearly and they trust me. And it's like, I work really hard to just get results, get to the nut of the thing, no drama. We're not here to talk about larger cultural issues. We're here to make this piece of music better. We can do that together. When I'm in the US, I think just talking about chamber music skills and things like that, I think some of the language I use is more common here.
Yeah.
So I'm quicker to jump in and deal with things on that level. Also because I think culturally, the way university systems is just a thing. I know how that flow works. And I know when water needs to be diverted to a different path to work smoother. I'm just not as fluent in Trinidad or in the Caribbean at large with the way those ecosystems navigate and the way the politics within those bands work, the way the politics between the arranger and the band manager who runs the band works. Sometimes there's a lot of communications there that are like unique to Trinidad and Tobago that like I have to respect because it's just the way things go. Band manager will come down and be like, I think you need to change this part of the tune. And so, wait, aren't you in charge of the shirts? Okay. But it's the guy who's been there in the yard for 30 years. And just knowing how that particular soup broth is made is something I have to work a little bit at when I go down to Trinidad.
Yeah. You touched on this next point briefly, talking about the stuff with Caroline Shaw. I've noticed a handful of ways in the United States that pan has become integrated in contemporary music, in percussion ensembles, mixed chamber ensembles, the use of extended techniques or pan with electronics, or like all these kind of quote unquote untraditional or more modern ways, or whatever you want to call it. My understanding, at least, is that's not happening so much in Trinidad. Correct me if you know otherwise, but what's your outlook on these other more contemporary uses of pan within the United States?
That's a good question. There's a million different ways to answer that. I think when I was in college, I started looking at the instrument as an instrument that wasn't just a calypso and soca instrument. It could be one that was experimental in nature. There wasn't a lot of contemporary pieces. I think at the time when I was a student at Akron in the year 2000, there was like 5 or 6 like solo works for double seconds in the world. Couple other things that had been like transcribed, but nobody was treating it like they were treating the piano or the violin, at least in my circle. And I say that just to put a pin in that. Like in my circle at Akron, that just wasn't part of the discussion. It was a strictly Caribbean style thing.
Yeah.
So I worked with this composer, Roger Zahab, who was running the new music ensemble there at the time. And I was like, man, would you ever consider writing a solo just like for my recital or whatever? He's like, sure. And he was like, how should I write for the instrument? And I was like, just here's the range. I'll play a little bit for you, but I really don't want you to worry about the historical baggage, because you don't worry about the historical baggage with the piano or the violin. You don't worry about that it was a folk instrument initially, the violin. Like it came out of the woods, for God's sakes. People, like traveling bands of people were using this around campfires, and now it's in an orchestra and we're doing this thing with it, right? And you don't necessarily have to engage with that history. Not that you shouldn't, but let's look at the steel drum as just a hunk of metal that makes a beautiful sound and has limitations and advantages. Start there. And so he wrote a piece where I use chopsticks and it gets this really beautiful tinkly sound. And as I learned more about the history of the steel pan, I did feel guilty about it a little bit, because there was some sort of like chatter starting to happen in the world once the internet and Facebook and all this other stuff started to become a way in which we pass judgment on things. There was a little bit of chatter of the word cultural appropriation started to get in my zeitgeist of a thing of maybe a white guy shouldn't be doing this with this instrument. The more I talk though with people like Liam Teague and Bugsy Sharp, and you start to learn about like some of the early tuners in Trinidad and a lot of the development of the steel band, it was one of constant fucking around and finding out. This idea of constant innovation is the way the steel band came about to begin with.
Right.
So to continue to see it as something that I don't want to change it. I'm not looking to make it different and make it something because I don't like the sound. I'm just like, yes, and what else? What else can we do with this? Seeing the way different arrangers in Trinidad approached their arrangements, like Bugsy taking things really out and doing random note sections where it just sounds like white noise. And you're like, what the hell is happening here? That's not soca. And it's still happening today. Like people are still experimenting with like wild versions of arrangements and different setups of pans and different double seconds with two guitars to augment your range a little bit more so you can play some bass lines. That approach has always been part of the soup in the steel band world in general. So, but now when I talk with composers like Steve Mackey or Dan Truman or Caroline Shaw, I do feel a tiny bit of responsibility just to be like, here's the nickel and dime tour of where why is this instrument even in the room with you right now? Like, I'm not going to bore them with all of the details of everything, but just you know, this instrument came from this. This is how it's commonly. Here's how I like to play it. Here's why I like to play it like this. Here's how some other folks have played this. Here's a recording of Bugsy playing. Take a listen to how he approaches this. Here's how Mia plays. Here's how Liam plays. Here's how Kendall plays. Here's how Andy Kehoe plays. Like, check it all out. And then at the end of the day, what do you want to do? Knowing all that, what do you think? And really just trying to keep an open mind, because the only pushback I've ever gotten from anybody on using the steel drum in any sort of context other than calypso music has come from people outside of the calypso and soca world.
Interesting.
Soca world. No one in Trinidad. I'm sure people have thoughts, to be clear.
Yeah.
But when the rubber meets the road, I think my intent with it and my love of the instrument and my care of the culture and the people and the food and all, like the fact that I personally feel like all of that is part of the soup, using the steel drum with Caroline Shaw or David Lang in his concerto that he wrote for So, which is not calypso at all, not even related at all. The music has nothing to do with Trinidad and Tobago, other than the fact that David liked the sound of the steel pans in that context. I think my intent reads to people, so I think most folks in the Caribbean who maybe have a question or maybe don't like what I do, that's fine. But the only pushback I've gotten is from intellectuals who are not involved with the scene at all. I have a responsibility to show a love for this instrument, to try to educate it to the point that I can, but then I'm going to get up tomorrow and keep doing it.
Yeah. Okay, I think my last question, if you had somehow the power to implement exactly what you want, what would you want to be different or more evolved with the United States kind of approach, especially things like a university context? If you could make something a little bit more universally true amongst our approach in the United States, or is there anything that you're like, I think we need to change our direction in this way?
I would change a few things. I think I would have a limitless budget or a massive budget to create more of a pipeline between the Caribbean and schools in the United States that foster the steel band program. I think NIU has done a really good job of that. I think when universities, and I think for a lot of really good reasons, started to put a really heavy emphasis on like diversity and DEIA and stuff like that. I looked at schools like NIU and I'm like, they've been doing this for 30 years.
Right.
Like, look at their program. Like, it's not all men. It's mostly Caribbean, African-American diaspora folks, but there's also white kids there. And it's like the mix of folks that is happening there at that university is really strong. And I think influences the way folks who come out of that, who are maybe from DeKalb, Illinois, in the middle of a cornfield, who just happen to go to NIU because it's a state school. I look at that and I'm like, it's because of a million reasons, but it's because they invested in this like international pipeline that really has developed, I think, the art form in both places. If there was a more pipeline to the University of Akron, to NIU, or to NYU, to Princeton, to University of Michigan, just to where folks from the Caribbean can get exposed to the culture here, for better and worse, And I think for folks to also spend time in Trinidad and experience that culture and learn things for better or worse. It's not like the grass is always greener. One place is not better than the other. They're just completely different, and they both have things that you can learn from. So that would be one. I would have a massive budget just to keep a flow of students cross-culturally and internationally to major universities in the United States. The other thing I would do is I would start a big pilot program like with the NEA or something to be like starting in like 5th grade. Every kid gets a subscription to Sibelius as part of your music studies, because one of the biggest barriers I've seen, again, in terms of the diversity push and the way that we talk about this stuff, it's like all the white guys are making all the money selling their percussion scores or whatever. It's like, well, yes, and is the problem any more nuanced than the fact that it's a white guy selling or a white woman or whoever's selling their scores? The Americans making all this money. It's like, yes, okay, why? Well, there's many reasons, but folks culturally were taught how to read music in the United States, taught how to read music and to write music down. I see so many arrangers in Brooklyn right now, Paige, and it just breaks my heart, who are like in the age ranges between 13 and 25 years old, who are writing some of the most badass arrangements for junior bands, for elementary bands, for elder bands. All of this amazing music is being written, but it's not being written down. And when I look at the course of history, I look at what is valued over hundreds and hundreds of years later. Beethoven is around not because he's a white guy, but because maybe part of it, but I think because this stuff was just on paper and people found it later. And then people wrote it down again and on better paper and then passed that down. And then we put it digitally and we can look at it and we can study it. I think 20 years down the road, if after every Panorama, there were 30 new charts that were published on a site ready to go, so that the University of Michigan or NYU or NIU or University of Akron could click on that and be like, I want to play the junior Panorama from Brooklyn from this past year because it was totally rad. To me, that would be the dream, because then I think these arrangers get paid money. How does So get gigs? We have video and we have music. So then these bands start getting hired. I think the music in the United States starts to become less of a like, oh, we did an arrangement of a Beatles tune, and more of a like, what are the folks who are at the horse's mouth of this instrument doing today? That's where the literacy comes in a little bit, not in that if you can't read music, you're not good. It's that, I want you to be able to read music so you can buy a Mazda Miata. Right now, I think the pipeline to the university thing with just bodies, like physical bodies exchanging ideas like that, I think is key. And then just the nuts and bolts of, it would break my heart if 300 years from now, nobody knew about Kendall. Nobody knew about Des Moines Morgan, or nobody knew about drummer boy Deshaun Wallace because it just didn't write it down. How many Beethovens, how many Bachs are there that just didn't? I'm sure Beethoven at the time was like, bro, you got to write some of this stuff down. And his buddy was like, nah, it'll be fine. And now we don't even know who that buddy was. And so anyway, that would be the magic pill I would give everybody, is like the ability to just quickly document. Anyway, I hope this has been somewhat helpful to anyone listening.
This has been great. And thank you. I know you're super busy, so I appreciate you making the time for it.
This is my pleasure. All right. See you, Paige.
See ya.